Was that you, Sue, or Marilyn? Yeah. Thank you. Sue down in the subs. Good evening, church. Good to see you tonight. Did you have a good afternoon? Did you get a little nap? Very little? All right, we are reading in Revelation 14, but before we go there tonight, I'd like to go back and take another gander for a few moments at what some of what we looked at this morning. Kind of rushed through. Oops, it's upside down. I kept thinking, boy, that thing is awful long. Yeah. Kind of rushed through some things this morning that I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions about and us work through a little bit slower to let it sink in because the text in Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 22 is kind of a display of a lot of the things that create disagreement about eschatology. So let's look at that again for just a moment. Remember, it starts out in verse 15 with Jesus referencing the abomination of desolation and the prophet Daniel. And he tells them that they can expect to see that abomination of desolation even though they thought that it was already over with. Now, if you haven't read the part of Israel's history when all of this happened, I would recommend that you do so. It's part of what we call the intertestamental period, or in other words, the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. A lot happened in Israel between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and this is one of the most dramatic events of all. Rather than recounting it, I'll just urge you to go read about it. But the point is that Jesus' listeners would have been absolutely certain that Daniel's prophecy about the abomination that causes desolation had already been fulfilled, and in very dramatic fashion, by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and the temple was cleansed and put back into operation in 167 B.C. So this is Jesus is about 30 years old, or a little more. This is 200 years before. So that would have been the first surprise, that they should expect another abomination that causes desolation. Now, is Jesus saying that what Antiochus did in 167 BC was not an abomination that causes desolation? Probably not. He's not saying that that wasn't a fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. So, what must he be saying? Okay, Jack says dual fulfillment. That here we have probably a good example, Exhibit A, of a prophecy in the Bible that is fulfilled more than one time. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind. And notice what Jesus said in verse 15, if you've got it open there. He says, when the abomination of desolation, when you see the abomination of desolation, that's hard to say right over and over again, abomination. And when you see the abomination that causes desolation, which the prophet Daniel spoke of, standing in the holy place, and then there's a little phrase there. Most of our English translations say, let the reader understand. The reader must understand. It's a strong statement. It's an imperative, third-person imperative. We don't have that in English, so it kind of sounds softer. It's a hard statement. He's saying, you got to understand this. Now, when I first read this years ago, I thought Matthew had added an editorial here, and he was telling his readers to understand what Jesus is saying. I don't believe that's correct. I've changed my view on that. I think these are actually the words of Jesus when he says, let the reader understand. It's part of what he said. And if that's the case, what is he referring, Jack? Okay. You understand, y'all have been with me long enough to understand that these are editorial decisions that are made after the fact. The words that Matthew wrote down weren't black and red, nor did they have quotation marks in them, okay? No brackets in ancient Greek. Mm-mm. No, it is not something that the writer added. When Matthew wrote the book, his gospel, he simply put a string of letters across the top line until he came to the end of that line, whether it was in the middle of a word or whatever. And he went to the next line and he went to the next string of letters. And his reader had to understand how to divide those letters into words. There weren't even any spaces between any of the words. No punctuation at all. None. Zero. Yes, sir. Well, I'm on this side. No, no. Now, there are words that are used in the original text that will indicate where quotation marks should be sometimes, but not always. And there's not. There you go. Well, I believe he did. And you can make a case for either one, but I think the case for these actually being a quotation of Jesus is very strong, and here's why. If Jesus said these words, to what is he referring? Exactly. And what did he just say? The prophet Daniel. And he just said something very, very provocative. He just said that there would be another fulfillment of a prophecy that his readers and his listeners would consider to have been done already. And so he's saying, it makes total sense that he would say, you need to understand when you read the book of Daniel what I'm telling you, that that's not the only time that this prophecy is going to be fulfilled. Okay? When you see, he places it in the future. Absolutely. Okay? So that's one of the keys to understanding prophecy that Jesus just handed us, is this idea that prophecies are not only fulfilled one time in the Bible. Some are. Jesus was only born once in Bethlehem. We don't expect that to happen again. But there are other prophecies, particularly those that are related to eschatology, to the end times, that can have precursors, if I can put it that way, that lead up to something else. All right, so we have, Jesus starts right out there in verse 15 with something that leaves us wanting to think through it. But then he goes on and he gives these descriptions. He says that those in Judea should flee to the mountains, that those on top of the roof should not come down into their house and take their belongings. Those who are in the field should not turn back and get their cloak. By the way, what he does there literally is he's essentially saying, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. Because the person at home on this roof, remember in Acts chapter 10, I believe it was, when Peter went up on the roof to pray? That's an example of how they used the roofs of their houses for different activities, depending on how wealthy they were and how big the roof was and so forth. But even a modest house, they would use the roof for different activities. And so he's saying, even if you're at home relaxing on your roof, you need to get out of town. Or if you're in the field, what would you be doing in the field? Working. So he's essentially saying, whatever you're doing, whether you're working or off, whether you're at home or somewhere else, whatever it is you're doing, you need to get out. You need to get out right away. Or you may end up with, I can't help but think about a particular lady from the Old Testament when I read these verses. Who might that be? Lot's wife, absolutely. You know, occasionally God says, a lot of times God says, I'll give you multiple chances to get this right. But occasionally God says, you don't get but one chance on this one. Get it right. And this was one of those. And by the way, when the Roman armies did come and surround Jerusalem, there were a lot of Christians who fled the area. Seems to be a historical fact. History from the first century can be a little difficult to pin down sometimes, but there's evidences that Jesus' word had been read by a lot of Christians by AD 70 who were living in that area, and when they saw what was happening, they left. Now, that's remarkable Because if we lived in the ancient Near East, and if we were close to a city like Jerusalem, and we saw the Roman armies of Titus coming to surround the city and to fight against it, our natural instinct would be to do what? Get inside the city walls as fast as possible, because that is the place of the greatest safety. And you, of course, you're counting on the fact that the city can hold out the siege and all of that. But if you stay in the open field, or if you try to flee the city, chances are you may be killed by the advancing army. And so Jesus is giving advice here that only those with the utmost trust would actually follow. Their instincts would have told them to do exactly the opposite, to get in the city as fast as possible. What happened to everybody who went into the city, by the way? It was horrible. Now, if you like to read background, again, I'll give you some reading here. Josephus, and I believe it's his works called Wars, or the Jewish War. Josephus was alive at this time, and he documents what this siege was like. It actually took 4 years. It started in 66 and ended in 70. So we say the temple was destroyed in 70. It was, but it was an ugly, horrible situation that lasted for about 4 years. Just to give you an example, the food ran out in the city and people started eating their own children. Okay, just that gives you some kind of an insight into the horrors that took place when the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed. So, what's that, Chris? Okay, well, it's out there, it's in print, and Josephus will be happy if you buy a copy of it, all right? And that was in 132. The Jews just couldn't get it right. You know, they were rebellious people, but they were rebellious because they believed in their heart of hearts that that country was God's country and nobody else should be in control of it. Now, there was a variety of Jews. There were some like the Sadducees who always cooperated, but the heart of the Jewish nation was that nobody else should be in control. Yes, ma'am. He said, run to the mountains. Jerusalem is surrounded by hills, and so they could just disappear up into the hills and get away. All right? So there's verse 15 and 16, and then he gives these descriptions of the flight, which really sound like the first century. Okay? Flat-top roofs, people with their cloak out in the fields. He says, woe to those who are pregnant or nursing babies in those days. And that would be true of any time when there's war. It's hardest on those most vulnerable. And who is more vulnerable than a lady who's carrying a baby or trying to care for a baby? And then he says, pray that your flight will not come in winter or on a Sabbath. This is still sounding very, very much like the first century here, because in the first century, it was very difficult to travel in the wintertime. In fact, the word for winter means rainy season, because there, the wintertime was the rainy season, and the roads would wash out, and it would just be very, very difficult to get around. Why does he mention the Sabbath? Yeah, you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. You can only travel so far on the Sabbath. If your life was at stake, the rabbis would tell you it's okay to break the Sabbath, but even so, if it's a Sabbath and you're trying to flee and everybody else has shut down their businesses, closed their city walls or whatever, it could still be an additional problem. Okay, so far so good. So we get to this point, it still sounds like the first century, but then Jesus brings up this language about there's never been a great tribulation like this before, there won't be one after. Unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, literally, is what it says there in verse 22. You can see what your translations do. These passages are interesting to look at in different translations, because you can see the beliefs, the eschatological beliefs of the translators really coming through in the way they render some of these words. No flesh would be saved, but those days will be shortened for the sake of the elect. Now, we looked at the rest of the passage this morning going up through verse 31, and Jesus gets to the point where he starts talking about the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from the sky or the heavens, the powers of the heavens being shaken. And you can really see your translators' thoughts about eschatology in verses like that, where how they render the word powers. Powers. Does that mean the natural powers in the sky, or does it mean the supernatural, angelic powers in the heavens, or does it mean both? It's hard to say. But when we get to these kinds of passages, those who want to put all of Jesus' predictions back in the first century, they're called preterists. They're people who say that Jesus was talking, everything that he says about the eschaton it was fulfilled in AD 70. Now, what do we have to do to make that happen? We have to do a couple of things at least. One, we have to take all this language about the sun being darkened and the moon not giving us light and the stars falling from the sky. As far as we know, that hasn't happened yet. Not literally. And so if they want to say that it's already happened, what must they do with that language? It's got to be figurative. There's no other way around it. Now, don't look down on them too quickly, because there are indisputable places in the Old Testament where that kind of language is used for political upheaval. So it is at least a possibility. I don't think that's what's happening here, because there are other places where that same language is used literally. And so there's at least a door open for them to walk through and to say that. There's other problems, I believe, with it, but never think that somebody, especially someone who has studied the Bible, never think that they have just made blatant errors in their eschatology, because that's an error. They may have, it's possible, but there's also a good chance that maybe they've thought through some things and considered some other passages and applied them in ways differently. Yes, sir? Well, here's why we're still here. Good question, Jordan. If all of Jesus' predictions have already happened, why are we still here? I have to ask another question. If those things have already happened, what about the coming of the Son of Man? What do we have to do with that? He's already come. That's exactly right. And it was secret, in a sense. When did he come, do you think? Just guess. I've said the date over and over again. AD 70. Yeah. There are people that believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ was in AD 70. Now, how do they get away with that? Well, they say that it was a spiritual coming, not a physical coming. It was spiritual, and those with spiritual eyes to see it were aware of it. Well, we don't have that much time. I'm going to give you the big building blocks here, and so that you feel more the reason I'm doing this, I want you to feel confident and comfortable reading these passages. Okay, Kathleen? Well, there's different ways probably that different ones would deal with that. One of the things that's hard about this is once you get into it all the way, you find that there's not just 2 or 3 different ways of looking at these things. There's about 50 or 60 different ways, because each one has several different versions to it. So I'll give you the big versions to keep it easier to deal with. All right. So Jesus came back in. This is interesting. If Jesus came back in 70, then what is verse 31 talking about when Jesus sent out his angels with a loud trumpet blast to gather his elect from the 4 winds and from one end of the heavens to the other, or one end of the sky to the other? If we change that from one end of the sky to the other, then it sounds more earthly, doesn't it? Because from our perspective, the sky hits the ground over there somewhere, I can see that, and the sky hits the ground over there somewhere, I can see that. So from one end of the sky to the other would be just another way of saying in all the earth, just like the four winds. So here's what happens, that the word angelos, which is the word for angel, also means what? And this happens to be true in the Old Testament too. Thank you, John. It means messenger. And yes, there are places in the New Testament where the word angelos clearly refers not to a celestial being, but to an earthly messenger. So it's simply an ambiguity in the word. That's just the way it is. Most of the time, I would say that it's pretty clear whether we're talking about a celestial being or an earthly messenger when the word angelos appears. And I don't think we're talking about earthly messengers here in verse 31. I think we're talking about celestial beings. But the preterist would say this, that Jesus came back in AD 70, and he sent his messengers out to gather the elect, and his messengers are the church missionaries, and they've been gathering the elect by preaching the gospel ever since then. Okay? Now, if you've never heard that before, at first it's like, whoa, wow, that was a curveball. But the more you listen to it, the more you think, well, maybe, but I don't think so. At least I can see how somebody would get there. So what we have here is language that Jesus uses that sounds like it has to be in the first century. Let's not forget the question that he's answering. The questions were, back in verse 3 of chapter 24, were what? When will these things happen, and what are these things? No, when will these things is what Jesus just said in verse 1. The temple's going to be destroyed. And they're like, whoa, what? When's that going to happen? And not only what they've done in their question is they've kind of confused things. To them, the idea of the temple being destroyed has to be the end of time. That's the only explanation. And so they say, well, if the temple's going to be destroyed, then that means you must be coming back and it's the end of the age. When's all that going to happen? And so Jesus answers the question, but clearly it doesn't all happen at the same time. And so he's making some kind of distinction between those events in the first century and the events that will happen at the end of time. But it turns out that there are some foreshadowings. And so there's some blending that goes on. Now, so we have to remember that he's answering that question. If he's not talking about the temple, well, let me put it this way. The fact that he's answering that question means that he must be giving some events from the first century. And those events sound first century-ish, at least until we get to the part where it says a great tribulation like there's never been. And I told you this morning the way that the preterist deals with that is they just say that that's all figurative language also. All right, so that's one way to look at this. It's kind of an extreme way. And they do interpret the book of Revelation exactly the same way. They go through the entire book and they put all of those events back into the first century. And they say that all that language that you and I read, and it sounds like the end of the age, they say it's just figurative, it's hyperbole, and it's related to political events that happened during the first century, the entire book of Revelation. All right? Got that? So that's one extreme view. So we come over here. What would be the opposite view? Well, the opposite view would be to take everything that Jesus says and say that it all refers to things that are going to happen just at the end of time. All right? And so, for instance, the abomination of desolation. They would say, when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, where was the abomination of desolation? Where's the fulfillment of that? And we really can't answer the question. Well, I don't know. Did somebody like Antiochus come into town and set up a statue of Zeus? Titus came in and destroyed it. His armies just surrounded the place, starved them out, and they were so angry. Titus actually wanted to save the temple, the way the story goes. But they were so mad and so angry by the way things had happened, that they just leveled the whole place in a fit of passion and rage. So, It could be, and that's a good answer. Just the fact that Roman soldiers came into the courts could itself be the abomination. Because remember how the courts were set up? There was the outer court, and who could go in it? The Gentiles. In the next court, ladies, next court, only the priests. Then you have the temple, and then you have the Holy of Holies, and you're down to the high priest one time a year, all right? So it could be that Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled simply by the soldiers going into the temple to destroy it. Others have said that the soldiers, they carried standards when they came into a town. It was a long pole with a cross part on it and a banner, and there was an eagle on it, and the Jews considered those standards to be idolatrous. They actually worshipped in front of them, whoever happened to be the Caesar. In fact, when Pilate first took over in Jerusalem, he had soldiers come in and they carried those banners, and the people just went crazy. They said those banners have to go out. That's another interesting historical story that I won't tell you. I'll let you look it up and read it on your own. So there are possibilities that there was an abomination that causes desolation in the first century. But those who want to put everything in the future would question that and say, maybe that's a reason to believe that really wasn't the fulfillment, that the fulfillment is going to be at the end of the age, which requires what? It requires the temple to be rebuilt. And even this becomes interesting because what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24 is the holy place, which most people take to be the temple, but it could just be where the temple was, or it could be the mount that Jerusalem stands on. Yeah, the thing that's difficult about these passages is that everything is arguable, and there's always someone who will argue it. Yes, Jordan? Yeah, if you take it literally, it does. But there are people who have become artists at taking passages of Scripture figuratively, and they get extremely good at it. They can take almost anything in the Bible to be figurative, even the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. And a lot of unbelieving denominations would do that. But that's another story. Let's stay with eschatology for a moment. Yeah, Chris? So Chris is talking about the possibility of two ages ending, the end of the church age and the end of the age, period. That would be what the preterist was saying, basically. They push all those events back into the first century and say that they're talking about a cataclysmic spiritual change, and you can somehow make them all fit things that were happening in the first century. Now, he says, I don't like dispensationalism. That's not necessarily true. It's not that I don't like dispensationalism. I don't mind telling you what happened to me. I grew up being taught dispensationalism, and I was taught dispensationalism as a dogma that was equal to the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. And when I began to read the Bible for myself, I realized that the Bible doesn't come anywhere close to emphasizing any particular chronological scheme of eschatology as it does the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. Everything else, every other doctrine must bow down to that doctrine. That is the doctrine. And it left me in a state that I don't mind being honest about. It left me in a state of skepticism about the things that I was taught about it. I try to be open-minded and listen carefully and look at the text. What does the text say? And I would tell you today that the reason that there is so much disagreement about eschatology in the church today is because the text does not clearly answer some of these questions. I don't care what anybody tells you. And I'd be happy to sit and go through it with you painfully slow if you need me to, because I love doing that. That's my job. And I do that all the time, and I can tell you that there are questions that people dogmatically teach as a doctrine that are not that clear. Not as clear as they make them out to be. So, back to what we're talking about. So we have this group over here that wants to put everything in the future. And I'm probably more comfortable over here because I'm a futurist too. I believe that a lot of these texts are addressing the future, and when it says that the sun is going to be dark, I take that literally. When it says that everybody will see Jesus come on the clouds, I believe everybody will see Jesus come on the clouds. When it says that he's sending angels out to gather his elect, I believe those are celestial beings. And when it says there's a loud trumpet blast, I believe there's going to be a loud trumpet blast. I believe that not only will people see Jesus, they will hear when he comes back. You know, if you happen to be inside the house with your TV turned off, God's going to make sure you get up out of your chair and walk outside and look by blowing the trumpet, all right? Nobody's going to be missed. Nobody is going to be missed. Everyone is going to be standing outside, and we'll have those two groups that we talked about this morning. So what is the problem, though, with pushing everything to the future? What can you think of right away would be a potential hermeneutical problem with just pushing all of these events to the future? There are places that just sound like it's addressing the first century. Now, some more rigid dispensationalists would say that there's going to be a Jewish revival, a Jewish ethnic revival, and so these things like flat-topped roofs and everybody keeping the Sabbath, that it will actually return to that kind of world. And Ezekiel's temple in the last part of his book plays into all of this. Again, it's possible, but it's all, those kinds of ideas are not stated directly. They're inferred by the person who is interpreting the text. And all of the texts that infer that could actually be taken another way. So you end up putting together a system, and you have to be humble about your system because whatever system you put together, there's weak places in it because the Bible doesn't support any one of those systems. I'll tell you what, the thing that makes me uncomfortable about the rigid dispensationalism and their look at the end times is this. And that not all dispensationalists do this, but the very rigid classical version of dispensationalism pretty much creates a new era of salvation in the tribulation. The church age, they would say, comes to an end. That troubles me theologically. The theologian in me really recoils at that because there is never an indication anywhere that the cross of Jesus Christ is nothing but the only plan for salvation from that point on and forevermore. And in fact, the cross of Jesus Christ was the plan. Before Jesus died on the cross, everything was looking forward to that. The rigid dispensationalist puts a division between the Jew and the Gentile that Jesus died to tear down, and it makes me uncomfortable. They're rebuilding that wall many times theologically, and that's one of the things that caused me to take pause when I looked at that scheme, which is what I was taught, and still probably feel most comfortable with. But one of the other problems with pushing everything to the future is that on this day when Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives looking at the temple and explaining these things, if he's only talking about things that would happen at least 2,000 years later, then he does not answer the question that they asked him. Is that possible? I guess anything's possible. Logically, it's possible. But it sounds to me like in verses 15, 16, 17, and 18 that he's answering their question, that he is talking about AD 70. But somewhere along the way, he flips over and he starts talking about the great tribulation at the end of time. And this is where a lot of the discussion is, where does that happen? Where does that happen? It looks like it happens to me when he says, in those days there will be. But even that is a little difficult because you would naturally take those days to be what he is already talking about. And of course the preterists would point that out. Yes, Jordan? Yeah, we'll talk about that next Sunday morning. We're going to finish up the chapter. So let me wrap it up by saying this. When you're looking at eschatology, and listening to somebody teach about eschatology, you can think about these two sort of borderline ways of looking at things. And there's probably, in the grand scheme of things, there's probably few people who, well, there's quite a few of them over here, unfortunately. The preterists who think it's all related to the first century. Some of them go so far as to say that Jesus was just wrong. Yeah. Well, I can't go with them, obviously. You know, we're parting ways at that point. I even have a hard time being polite then, you know, because I don't go with Jesus is wrong. That's not part of my hermeneutic. But there's a larger group over here. Why would that be so, by the way? Why would there be more people here than over there? Well, and probably the simplest reason, though, those are both right, but the simplest reason is that we live in a world of skepticism. They don't believe that Jesus is coming back or any of that stuff's going to happen. And so they are forced to, if they even try, and here's the funny thing about it, you get somebody who is 16, 17, 18 years old and they feel called to preach or minister, and they go to a Bible college for 4 years, and then they go to a seminary for a couple of years and get a master's, and then they go back to the seminary for a couple more years and get a doctor's degree, and then they go out and serve in some Methodist or Episcopal church for a while, and they start reading all this stuff, and they realize along the way somewhere that they don't believe the Bible anymore. Now what are you going to do? You know, you've got your retirement and your life insurance. Now, I'm just being real here. You got your retirement, you got your life insurance, you got your job. You didn't learn how to do anything else. All you've ever studied is theology. All you've ever done is work in a church. What are you going to do? Are you going to be honest and say, I don't believe this anymore, and walk away from the church and walk away from your retirement and walk away from your health insurance and walk away from your life insurance, walk away from your career, and start back over again when maybe you're in your late 30s, early 40s, and try to figure out a way to make a living? No, what are you going to do? You're going to stay in the church, and you're going to convince the church. Well, you can do two things. You can stay in the church and pretend you believe, and there's people doing that. I'll tell you, one of the weirdest things I learned in seminary was how to read people who are writing about the Bible who don't believe in the Bible, but they make it sound like they do. That's a bizarre place to be in. You know, it's got the fingerprints of Satan all over it. Satan loves confusion. And one of the best ways to create confusion in the church is to put a bunch of unbelievers in charge of the church. And he's figured out a way to do that. And that has happened in a lot of denominations. It was starting to happen in our denomination back in the 1950s and 60s. And certain groups stood up in the 1970s and 80s and said, that's enough of that. We believe the Bible. If you don't believe the Bible, you have the right to do that, but go start your own church. Don't take ours. All right? I get upset at that. People try to come into a church and change it into something that it's not and take the church over. That's just not honest. That is satanic. I don't mind saying that. It is satanic. Yes, did you have something, Jack? It's all figurative, Jack. You just need to get that through your head. What about figurative do you not understand? You can make it mean anything. Sure. Absolutely. That's right. Or more extreme, that was a guy who was wrong, and we don't need to listen to him. Now, I predict, and this is not a prophecy, it's a prediction, but I predict that you're going to hear that more often. Jesus was simply wrong. You need to stop listening to him. Okay? And those folks are all already around. So here we have our two boundaries. This boundary, this one is very uncomfortable for me. I don't like this side at all. I don't mind reading what they have to say and thinking about it, mostly to debunk it more than anything else. And then we have this more extreme view over here, the classic dispensationalist view. I'm far more comfortable here. This is what I was taught with, what I grew up with. But I've just learned from the text that a lot of those positions, although they may turn out to be right, they're not as clear as some people say they are. They're not as supported as some people say they are. And they come out with some bizarre results sometimes. I'll give you two examples. I've already given you one. One that I consider to be a bizarre result is to start to try to build the wall between Gentiles and Jews again. I think that's theologically incorrect. Ephesians 2 makes it clear that that wall has been torn down. Romans says that we, Gentiles, have been grafted in. There's no indication that we're ever going to be pulled out again. We are in. We're grafted in. We're part of what God is doing. Here's another bizarre result that happens is some people would say that because of all of this strict dispensationalism, that when Jesus is teaching in Matthew 24, he's not talking to you. So you really don't even need to bother with this chapter. He's talking about future Jews. And since you're not a Jew, then you don't have to listen to Matthew chapter 24. Now, that's an extreme example of that teaching. But when you come up with a hermeneutic that tells a Christian that they don't have to listen to what Jesus is saying in the New Testament, then I blow the whistle. Because that hermeneutic would lead us to ask, well, why do I have to listen to the Sermon on the Mount? Or why do I have to listen to this or that? The answer would be, well, he's not talking about eschatology there, and there would be a debate that would be entered into. But I'm just saying that that is a potentially bizarre result from a strict, rigid, classic dispensationalist view that causes me to rethink and look back through those things. So what is that third option? I mentioned it this morning. How do we make sense out of all of this? Yes, Paul? Baptists are a broad group, and you can find a lot of different eschatological views in the Baptist church. At Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, where I got my master's degree, there have been people who were recognized as great theologians who were amillennial. They didn't believe in the premillennial version of Revelation. If you don't know what that means, we'll get to it in chapter 20 in the book of Revelation. And they wrote under the auspices of Southern Baptist and Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. So there's a big tent among Baptists, and these kinds of views are not seen as a litmus test. They're debated and talked about, which is what we should do. You know, we should be willing to listen to somebody that disagrees with us and ask ourselves, are they basing what they say on Scripture? And if they're not, then we should be able to say to them, without getting mad, I think you're wrong, and here's why I think you're wrong. And then they should be able to tell me, I think you're wrong, and here's why I think you're wrong. And that's that iron sharpening iron. And we all work slowly forward to try to gain a greater understanding of eschatology. Baptist is a big tent also when it comes to other theological constructs like Calvinism and Arminianism. And that may not mean anything to you. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. You can ask me about it later or look it up. But there's a diversity of theological opinions within the Baptist group. What we've tried to do as Baptists is say that what distinguishes us is that we believe the Bible is true. Now, there's a lot of details that have to be worked out in that, but we haven't gone to this extreme over here that some have in the Methodist group, and there are some Baptists that are over here too, unfortunately. Not many in the Southern Baptist Convention, but other Baptist groups. We are trying to stay away from this conclusion that everything in the Bible is just figurative. Jesus may have been wrong about things. All that really matters is that we just love one another. That's what you end up with. Okay? All right. So, what's that? No, I don't even like standing over there. What the point is? Well, do you remember a couple of weeks ago I talked about a Canadian woman who has gone through this process. She now doesn't believe that doesn't believe that God exists, but she's still a pastor in a church in Canada, and they still have a national church. And they decided to leave her in there. She went through a pilgrimage, much like what I just described to you, where over a period of years, she finally decided that she didn't believe in God, and she's in her 60s now. What are you going to do? She's decided to stay in the church and to convince her congregation that they should just learn how to love one another and take care of the earth, and those are the things they talk about in church. And in the article that I read, she and her husband were writing new things for them to quote to one another because they aren't going to use the Bible anymore. Why are they not going to use the Bible anymore? Very simple answer: they don't believe it. What's the point? That comes back to your question. What's the point of reading the Bible if you don't believe it? If you're in a church that doesn't believe the Bible, eventually you're going to realize that the Bible isn't being used much. Or even if it is, it's being used very selectively. You're going to hear, maybe Psalm 23 or some other feel-good text, but you're certainly not going to hear the text that we're about to read in the book of Revelation, not tonight because I'm out of time, but next week, where it talks about hell. There's just not going to be any conversations about hell. There's not going to be any conversations about the fact that there's only one way to heaven. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. That's not inclusive enough. And I don't have to tell you about that because you're reading the news. Okay? So let me try to wrap this up. All right? We've got these two extremes, two boundary views. I'm trying not to use the word extreme, but two boundary views. And how can we kind of navigate these waters? And here's what I believe is biblical and what I'm doing to navigate the waters of eschatology. I believe that the Bible teaches that there are certain prophecies that are fulfilled partially along the way, and then ultimately there's a final fulfillment at the end. And I believe that what we're seeing in Jesus' language in Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 to 22 is a prime example of that. The destruction of the temple was a foreshadowing of another event in the future. I can't claim to know exactly what that event is, but that wasn't the final event. There's another cataclysm that's coming along. Now, can I defend this from any other text or any other example in the Bible? And I can, and it happens to be another example that's eschatological. John, in his first letter, in the second chapter, said that, this is in the first century, mind you, he said, many antichrists have already gone out. But in the same breath, he says that there is one Antichrist who is going to come at the end. For me, that passage of Scripture is a key that opens up a lock to understanding prophecy. And it turns out that when you walk into that room, you find plenty of other examples of these kinds of things happening in the Bible, where God uses historical patterns, that he does many of the same things over and over again in history. They're never exactly the same the second and third time, but all of this is moving toward a climax where there will be one Antichrist, there will be one desolation that causes, one abomination that causes desolation. There will be a point that we come to where everything comes to an end, a climax. And so our understanding of prophecy becomes more complex, but it's more rich. And another example is that the temple has already been destroyed. How many times? At least twice. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. That was Solomon's temple in the early 6th century BC. And it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Some might say that that was actually the third temple, because the temple that was rebuilt when they came back from Babylon was so disappointing, and the Bible tells us this, that when Herod was king, and he is certainly not a good guy in the Bible, but one of the things that he did is he rebuilt the second temple. And what he did is they put sort of a shell up before they took down the actual temple to rebuild it, because the idea of taking it down would just be too disturbing for most Jews. You're going to do what? You're going to take down the what? Wait a minute! And so they went through all these contortions, but they actually did take down that second temple and rebuild it. And so technically you could say that was the third temple, but it's usually called Second Temple Judaism. Oh my goodness, I love our time together, and I could just go on and on and on, but I better stop. And we didn't read a single verse in the book of Revelation tonight. But I promise you we will. Maybe I shouldn't promise. I promise you we'll try to next Sunday night. This is a fascinating discussion, though. And it's not just some empty philosophical academic discussion. This is real. This is at the heart of our faith because it says that Jesus is in heaven, alive and well at the right hand of God, and he will come back. He will appear. We will see him, and we will go to be with him. Those are real things. And that changes, or it should change, the way that we live our lives on Monday morning, Wednesday afternoon, and Saturday. It changes everything because we have a destination, and that destination changes our journey. All right. Appreciate you being here tonight. We'll pray, and we'll sing a song and be dismissed. Father in heaven, we thank you, God, that Jesus is coming back. We thank you for your word. It's simply incredible what you have given us. What a treasure we have. We want to take full advantage of it. We want to understand it to the extent that we can, that you want us to. We thank you for your Spirit that illuminates the Word, Father, and we pray that we would have enough confidence in our understanding of your Word to be messengers of your truth. In Jesus' name, amen.